I recently bought the Bremont Supernova, and it feels sensational. The Supernova is my third integrated bracelet stainless steel watch after my 1978 vintage Rolex Oyster Quartz and my A Lange Sohne Odysseus. Arguably, all three watches fit into the same genre that's been around for 50 years, and it's one that's still growing in popularity, decades after first making an appearance. These other two watches feel fabulous too, but in different ways and for very different reasons. Initially, I wondered whether it might be interesting to do a comparison and review of all three of these watches in detail. They all have integrated stainless steel bracelets after all. But then I started to dig a little deeper into my personal motivations, the reasons why I made every one of these purchases, and how and why each of these watches makes me feel as they do. And I concluded that actually, for me, the fact that these watches happen to be stainless steel and that they happen to have integrated bracelets was not the primary driver. Sure, I love the bracelets on these watches. They're a large part of the overall watch experience. I also love the way each of them looks. You can take that as read, but what really makes these watches feel great and what gives them significance, purpose, and meaning beyond their core design and functionality is inextricably linked to my perception of and my relationship with not just the watches themselves and their bracelets, but the watch brands. That's how I feel. At the core of it all, the brand is important to me, and what I think and feel is all that really matters, to me at least. That's at the root of my watch enthusiasm. It's emotional, and if you're anything like me, I suspect that much the same stands to reason for you too. So I thought I'd compare the three watch brands and how they make me feel. And that's what this video is about. Whatever your own watch enthusiasm is about, as I like to say, we are all masters of our own experiences. All three of these watch brands have arguably tapped into the zeitgeist, the trend that began over 50 years ago with Audemars Piguet's Royal Oak, which was back then a daring and revolutionary design. There was initially some controversy around the Royal Oak shortly after its release, before huge international success ensued. There are many other watch brands that have since followed suit by creating their own version of a stainless steel watch with an integrated bracelet, and that in itself is something that can be a little controversial and divide opinion. A Lange Sohne was much criticized when the Odysseus was first launched. There were many dissenting voices following the release of the initial press shots, and yet now, a few short years later, all appears to have been forgiven and forgotten. Minds seem to have changed. And even if I have interpreted that incorrectly, what we do now know is that the Odysseus has become much desired, there are multi-year waiting lists, and the watch is trading on the secondary market for a multiple of its retail price. Change of any kind is often met with resistance, and acceptance, adoption, and advocation tends to occur over time. Being the most recent of these three watches to be released, the launch event was in October, Bremont Supernova has similarly received early criticism. In parallel, others like me love it. Social media tends to polarize views. Again, the early critics might simply be railing against change, and not least because Bremont is setting new standards for British watchmaking, and for watchmaking more generally. They're challenging the status quo. Personally, I don't pay much attention to the naysayers, and not least because there are always a range of views, and there is always an opposing one. Mine happens to be a hugely positive one. As I say, I love the way the Supernova looks, and also how it feels, and I admire everything it stands for, but more of that later. For A Lange Sohne, launching the first of a new family of watches produced in stainless steel was a big deal. The brand had only ever made watches in precious metals prior to that, with the exception of a special one-off. The Odysseus was the brand's first foray into stainless steel sports watches. Well, A Lange Sohne referred to the Odysseus as being sporty elegant. The bracelet on the Odysseus is superb, and I believe it's best in class. I don't want to go into great lengths here and repeat what I've said before in a previous video, where I did go into great detail about this watch, But in short, I believe the Odysseus bracelet is superior to any other watch bracelet that I've ever encountered, and it's a major part of the Odysseus's identity and wearing experience. This is superlative comfort, being easily micro-adjustable on and off the wrist. It presents both casually and yet smart too, and offers an all-round practical option. Plus, to my mind, it also represents the best in class from a horological and artisanal perspective. It's a front-row candidate for the classic one-watch collection. When I first learned about the Odysseus, I wasn't so interested in the fact that it had an integrated stainless steel bracelet, or an integral one, depending on how you look at it, but the fact that it was a stainless steel watch that was a sporty, practical, high horology choice from this exalted watch brand. I haven't ever sold a watch. However, if push came to shove and I needed to, casting sentimental reasons aside, I'd consider selling all my other watches and might just keep this one. For Rolex, their Oyster Quartz was as much, if not more, about the advent of the quartz movement during the 1970s than it was about the bracelet, although its integrated bracelet design made it immediately visually distinguishable from its competitors, as well as from anything Rolex had produced before or since. During the 1970s, the advent of quartz watches was a perceived threat to mechanical watchmakers. They were more accurate than mechanical watches and significantly cheaper too. It seems that many mechanical watchmakers felt they needed to respond, and the Oyster Quartz was Rolex's answer to the quartz movement. Mine is one of the earlier Rolex Oyster Quartz models. It was produced in 1978, prior to the Oyster Quartz achieving the COSC certification. Hence, it's only got 3 lines on the dial. Later models had 4 lines because they also featured the words officially certified. Nobody knows, however, I'm guessing that there were less than 1,000 of these made, which makes this Oyster Quartz a rarity amongst rarities. It's estimated that there were 25,000 Rolex Oyster Quartz made in total, before the range was discontinued by Rolex in 2001. To put that in perspective, it's estimated that Rolex produce over 1 million watches each year. The Rolex Oyster Quartz is the smallest of these 3 watches, having a 36mm case diameter, although it does look, feel, and wear slightly larger on the wrist because of the bracelet design. In photographs, the bracelet always appeared thick, heavy, and almost industrial in design. However, in hand and on wrist, it's got a far more delicate demeanour, which came as a pleasant surprise to me when I first got hold of it. My wife occasionally opts to wear my Rolex Oyster Quartz. The bracelet itself is delightfully light and thin, and whilst it does have a micro adjustment, you need to have a tool handy to make any adjustments here, there isn't an easy option for an adjustment when on the fly. The faded and now defunct lume aside, I think my Oyster Quartz is still a very wearable, modern stainless steel watch. It's a practical daily wear, and almost half a century later, the quartz movement has stood the test of time and is still going strong, provided you change the battery every few years. The quartz accuracy remains pretty much spot on, and in that sense, the Rolex Oyster Quartz performs better than any mechanical watch I own. The Bremont Supernova is my most recent watch purchase and has now been on my wrist almost continuously for 3 weeks. At first blush, when attending Bremont's H1 generation launch event, my instant reaction to the Supernova was all good. For my part, there was a great deal of curiosity and excitement, and not just at the launch event, but also in the weeks that followed, when I was waiting to get reacquainted with the Supernova again, to decide if I really did want to make a purchase. The launch event was after nightfall at the Tower of London, and the lighting in the room was dreadful, which made it difficult to properly take in all this new information first time round. Well, for me at least. My subsequent encounter at the Bremont Mayfair boutique was during daylight hours, and since buying the Supernova, it's personally reassuring to me that my feeling of buyer's delight has only continued to be reinforced and to grow stronger. As I say, it's sensational. There's been quite a lot of chatter about the Supernova online, and I'd like to address some of the more frequently cited queries and points that I've picked up on social media, alongside me spotlighting a few things of my own. So here's my take on the Supernova. The bracelet is far more shiny and sparkly than I had appreciated from photos and videos. Given the shapes and sizes of all the various surfaces and the way these moving parts have been finished, the bracelet really does catch the light from all sorts of angles and in a really pleasing way. In fact, I think the Supernova is a candidate for the least understated and most flashy Bremont I've seen yet. There's a polished chamfer along the top edge of the bracelet which runs from the crown down to the clasp. It's more obvious at the crown and tapers down towards the bracelet edge, disappearing completely as you get to the clasp. It's a clever and subtle design feature, and it plays beautifully with the light, in contrast to the brushed finishes. The bottom edge of the bracelet doesn't have this feature, which makes it feel precision cut and almost sharp when handling. This isn't something I feel at all when worn on the wrist. The links also have thinly polished chamfered edges, which brilliantly catch light in an altogether different way to the brushed stainless steel surfaces as the watch is moved. It's a quality item, and it brings a certain flair and dress watch dimension to an otherwise very practical tool. I had occasion to dress up during the last few weeks, and I thought the Supernova more than does the job. Just to be certain, I double-checked with my wife, whose nod of approval confirmed that it absolutely looks the part when worn with black tie. At first glance, the Supernova bracelet is reminiscent of the Royal Oak bracelet. Arguably, that's part of the controversy, and perhaps the appeal. However, on closer inspection, it's clear how the two bracelets are quite different. You might say that there are only so many ways you can design a watch with an integrated stainless steel bracelet. But to accuse Bremont of making this watch and bracelet as a Royal Oak rip-off is a nonsense. It's a bit like saying that every car since the Model T Ford is a copy, simply because they all have four wheels, an engine, and a steering wheel. My own view is that Bremont absolutely have their own look and design, and are very much making their own way here. Initially, the bracelet irritated the underside of my wrist. I couldn't quite understand this at first until I realized that the scratchy feeling I was experiencing was the almost invisible protective plastic film that had yet to be peeled off. It had raised and wrinkled slightly, and the edge of the plastic film was causing irritation. After peeling it off, I found the Supernova very comfortable to wear. Whilst it's solid, feels great on the wrist, and is clearly really well made, for me, one niggle and slight disappointment of the Supernova bracelet is the lack of a micro adjustment. Clearly it wasn't a deal breaker for me because I bought the Supernova, but I would have liked this feature to have been incorporated. It's something that I've come to really appreciate on the Odysseus, and of course, I now want it on all my other watches too. At the point of purchase, I had a few of the links, and a half link, removed, having made the decision to have the Supernova fit my wrist slightly looser than I've grown used to, wearing my Odysseus at least. It's a bit like how I wear my Rolex Oyster bracelets. And yet the practical reality is that over the last 3 weeks, I haven't at any point been uncomfortable with the lack of an on-the-fly micro-adjustment, which I think helps to put this particular issue, the micro-adjustment, into context. I really like the way the clasp looks and how it features the Bremont logo. It's classy and a big improvement on the original Bremont bracelets. The lug-to-lug measurement of the Supernova at 53 millimeters is something that is repeatedly flagged online as simply being too big. I'd only become aware of the dimensions after the launch event that I'd attended. At the time, I wasn't aware of these dimensions, and I'd briefly worn the Supernova on my wrist, and it looked a good size and a good fit. I didn't think or feel it was too big nor overbearing. And yet, subsequently, seeing comments about the dimensions online did, to a degree, leave me second-guessing myself. It made me pause and wonder, did I get wrapped up in the moment at the launch event and miss this obvious size issue? Is it an issue? The advertised case diameter at 40 millimeters is really welcomed by me. I'm increasingly inclined towards wearing this size as opposed to the more traditionally Bremont 43 millimeter cases. However, the lug-to-lug measurement escaped me at the time of the launch event. On paper, 53 millimeters is a longer or a bigger size than most other watches I own, and many people online seemingly felt that dimension is larger than they can wear and or relate to. Well, I can feed back that the size of the Supernova works really well on my reasonably skinny 6¾ inch or 17 centimeter wrist. And I haven't found the Supernova too large in the last few weeks either. I'm not a watch designer and I can't really explain why or how the Supernova works and fits so well, in spite of the on-paper dimensions. It might have something to do with the 11.1mm thickness of the watch, which is the thinnest Bremont that I own. Might that have something to do with it? The relatively small dial size arguably makes it more wearable too. Moreover, this is by definition a bracelet, so it's not quite the same as a watch that's worn on a strap. The integrated bracelet is supposed to wrap all the way around the wrist. It might also be related to the fact that the 53mm actually measures from one end of the outermost rigid part of the bracelet to the other. It's not a like-for-like comparison with the usual lug-to-lug measurement, and I don't believe you can directly compare with non-integrated bracelet dimensions. In direct comparison with the Oyster Quartz, which has a much smaller 47mm, and the Odysseus at 52mm, it is larger than both these watches. But again, I certainly don't believe the Odysseus is too large for my wrist. Far from it. Interestingly, while I've never got hands-on with a Vacheron Constantin overseas, Tim Mosso did a review of that watch recently and cited this same measurement for that watch as being 56.7mm for what that's worth, so bigger still. Whatever the design reason and technical explanation, what my experience underscores for me is the importance of reserving judgment and the need to hold back from leaping to conclusions on such matters until you've actually had a chance to personally try a watch on and wear it yourself. I admit to getting a bit spooked by the online chatter about this lug-to-lug dimension, and having left the launch event feeling as though I'd really like to own a Supernova, I began to question myself as to whether I'd missed something obvious. The key lesson here, for me, is not to blindly accept the opinions and views or reviews from others online. And again, it underscores the importance of getting some first-hand experience of your own. As I say, following the Bremont H1 generation launch event, the only real decision for me was whether I ought to opt for the Supernova with the black dial or the blue dial. I think they're both beautiful, so you can't really go too far wrong, but it got me thinking. The Odysseus, which gets far more wrist time than my Oyster Quartz, has a blue dial, so black was an alternative colour option. However, the Supernova black dial features Arabic numerals, as compared to the blue dial version, which has stick indices. Both the Arabic numerals and the stick indices are applied and stand proud from the dial, which brings a third dimension to it. They visually pop. When you look at the vast majority of other stainless steel sports watches on the market, the vogue is for them to feature stick indices on their usually blue dials. The indices are arguably a more often seen design. It's more representative of the status quo. To my mind, this was in itself a key reason to veer away from getting the version featuring the stick indices, primarily because the Bremont Supernova isn't trying to be like all the others. Bremont is a challenger brand that wants to stand out and be a bit different. So for me, this version with the Arabic numerals was ultimately the way to go. There are a few other features which make the Supernova rather different. The bezel is only very slightly raised, and recessed within it is a flat sapphire crystal that is completely flush with the top face of the watch. This flatness is further accentuated by the shape of the lugs, and overall this gives the Supernova a really distinctive and unique look. This watch very much has its own design language and quite masculine DNA, and I think it sets the Supernova apart in a subtle and yet characterful way. I believe the style of the crown is also designed differently from previous Bremonts. It protrudes at its top ever so slightly and is unlike any other Bremont crown that I've encountered. The Supernova dial has various finishes, with the center section being finely frosted, in contrast to the grooved ring that the numerals sit upon and the outer tilted edge. The power reserve indicates how much time you have left of the 65 hours when fully wound, and it helps balance the dial. I like that I can remove this watch on a Friday and put it back on Monday morning without needing to reset the time or even wind the watch again. The hour and minute hands appear to be shaped like the newer hand design of the MB2, which is something that I regard as a positive step for Bremont as they continue to expand and yet retain their own design language and identity across their different watches. It always strikes me how you can often tell the brand of certain watches simply by looking at the hour and minute hands. That's not always been as obvious with Bremont hitherto. I noted with interest that the big date window of the Supernova is made up of two numeric rings, a bit like the Hawking and the Longitude, and that this watch has for the first time displayed the words "Made in England" at the 6 o'clock position. On the reverse is a sapphire crystal caseback, enabling a good look at the ENG movement. Whilst you almost might miss it, there's a small yet significant symbol, H1, engraved into the rear of the caseback. This refers to Bremont's H1 timing standard. Because they're not Swiss, the COSC testing cannot be applied to the watch, and whilst the base standard is still ISO 3159, the H1 goes further than this, and also further than COSC by testing the complete movement with its automatic bridge, winding mechanism and rotor already assembled. The H is a nod to John Harrison and also Henley, and the number 1 suggests to me that the Bremont timing standard will go further and become ever more advanced, presumably with H2 and H3 to follow in time. Again, they're nothing if not ambitious. The overall heft, look, and feel of the Supernova on the wrist is really pleasing. Its quality is reassuringly evident, and I've found myself enjoying it ever more so each passing day. Hitherto, Bremont has focused their marketing primarily on their British engineering and the design and technology DNA that's evident in their timepieces. It's been about their patented technology, the triptych case design, the extra hardened steel that the watches use, which makes them several times more scratch resistant than many other stainless steel watches on the market today, and the fact that their watches have been tested beyond endurance. Then last year, Bremont introduced the Longitude, the first watch to include the ENG 300, which is referred to as a Bremont manufactured movement. Bremont were very clear and upfront to explain how they had bought the IP rights to the movement from THE Plus, a Swiss company, and had since altered the watch to their specification to the extent that 80% of the movement by weight has been customized or modified. If you haven't yet been to the wing in Henley, it's well worth a visit. What Bremont are doing is frankly jaw-dropping. They've invested heavily in their production and technology capabilities and are now way beyond being a startup or microbrand. I believe that Bremont have broken through and are positioning themselves for significant development and growth at scale. Few watch brands anywhere in the world have achieved what Bremont are attempting. It's very exciting, hugely inspiring, and really quite remarkable. Bremont has always been determined to play a pivotal role in the reinvigoration of British watchmaking, and they lead this movement to manufacture beautiful mechanical watches that can compete with any watch manufacturer in the world. There's a dynamic and shifting landscape in the watch industry which is challenging the decades of Swiss dominance, arguably led by both the German and increasingly the British watchmakers too. The Supernova is a bit of a statement timepiece and perhaps a style. There's quite a lot of flair from this brash young upstart brand. In that sense, I suppose you could say that the Supernova is a bit more Lamborghini than it is Ferrari, more TikTok than Facebook, more contemporary than traditional. The bracelet integration is somehow an ever more obvious direction for the brand to have gone, to me at least. I'm still not sure that that's the right description, but I'm asking these questions of myself, and that's the best I can describe for now. And let's talk about the price, £7,995, which has sparked a lot of discussion, so I felt I couldn't ignore this matter. James Stacey at Hodinkee says, the most watch for your money scales tip at somewhere around $3,000. Anything more, and you're buying an emotion, which is a big part of the appeal and irrationality of watch collecting. That sort of touches upon what I wanted to get into, and it's why I opened this video expressing how the Supernova makes me feel. Each of these three watches are very different, and they have very different propositions. In all honesty, I'm not sure you can really compare them at all. However, for what it's worth, A Lange Sohne no longer have a price tag, on their website at least, for the Odysseus in stainless steel. However, I bought mine in February for £26,700. In other words, the retail price of the Odysseus is more than 3 times the retail price of the Bremont Supernova. Are they comparable? Not really, no. However, they are, sort of, at least in the sense that, having now worn the Supernova non-stop for a few weeks, I haven't really felt compelled to take it off my wrist, simply to replace it with my Odysseus. In fact, I haven't yet wanted to take the Supernova off my wrist for any other watch at all, and have instead been enjoying its versatility in a variety of situations: dress up, tennis, casual, suited and booted. And to me, that's interesting. Of course, I believe the Odysseus is superior in almost every aspect when compared to the Supernova, but I have nevertheless found wearing the Supernova instead of, and in preference to the Odysseus, surprisingly enjoyable. I don't want to take it off or swap it out. So, new watch novelty or honeymoon period aside, I've found that there are occasions or periods of time when the Supernova is better than the Odysseus. Subconsciously, I think a key reason is that I enjoy not feeling like such an obvious target for violent watch thieves, which is an increasingly common occurrence in London right now. Thieves are being trained to know and recognize the hot, high-value and unattainable watches which they can easily sell on. I'm not suggesting the Supernova isn't worth stealing, but it is far less saleable on the secondary market without box and papers than some of the white-hot watches like a Patek Philippe Nautilus or indeed an A Lange Sohne Odysseus. My Odysseus was independently valued earlier this year for insurance purposes and is available on the secondary market for around 10 times the retail price of the Supernova. The Odysseus valuation reflects the fact that you simply can't acquire this watch at retail price unless you've previously bought an A Lange Sohne watch from the brand or from one of their authorized dealers, and unless you have oodles of patience, because at last check, the waiting list was stretching to a few years. In comparison, I paid £4,649 for my Rolex Oyster Quartz in June 2020, and it now trades on the secondary market for almost £7,000. Both these watches have not only held their value, but have in fact appreciated in value since purchase, the Odysseus in particular. As I say, I've never sold a watch, and value appreciation has never been my primary wish. However, for these two watches, it is a happy reality, and undeniably, that does help promote a feeling of well-being as an owner of these timepieces. The main difference with the A Lange Sohne Odysseus is that both the Rolex Oyster Quartz and Bremont Supernova are being sold at prices that are in a different league from the Odysseus. They're not to be sniffed at, of course. £7,000 or £8,000 is still undeniably luxury watch territory, but equally they are less likely to require you to remortgage your home. It might seem odd to actually say this, but the Supernova is actually available to order, purchase, and can be individually hand-assembled and on your wrist within 4 to 6 weeks. At least that's what the Bremont website says. For now, at least. Whether the Supernova holds its value, appreciates, or loses value once acquired remains to be seen, but in all honesty, and without wishing to sound crass, because price and value is undeniably always a consideration, no matter who you are, I don't really care either way. I just love it. My Instagram profile includes a quote that I think is apt to repeat here. If beauty is in the eye of the beholder, then value is in the perception of the purchaser. I bought and now own the Supernova, so by definition, I think it's worth every penny. However, given that the Supernova is a watch of many firsts, I suspect that over time it might well prove to be one of the more likely Bremont candidates to gain a bit of a following and to become one that watch collectors covet. Returning to the topic of value and perception. In June this year, Monochrome interviewed Wilhelm Schmidt, CEO of A Lange Sohne, and during that interview he described a different type of watch collectors as 1. People who collect things to be recognized by others, 2. The investment collector, and 3. The passionate collector. According to Schmidt, the passionate collector is who they want to have, as their core clientele. And I think that I am primarily that guy and very much fit the bill. I'm a passionate watch enthusiast. My decision making is mostly based upon love. But of course, life isn't black and white, and watch collecting isn't binary. So at the same time, I nevertheless do like the notion that the watches I own might hold their value over time, or better. It's something that I reassure myself about and which resides in the back of my mind. I think I use that notion to reassure myself that it's not just okay to continue acquiring more watches to pass down to my sons in the full course of time, but it's actually a really good idea. Perhaps it's a form of self-induced delusion. As I said early on in this video, beyond the integrated stainless steel bracelets and the obvious fact that all three watches tell the time, I'm not sure that there is a great deal more in common other than the fact that I happen to own these three watches for different reasons. So that's about as much watch comparison as I'm going to do here. And so on to the point that I also wanted to share in this video, which for me is about my relationships with the watch brands themselves. I admire all three watch brands in very different ways and for very different reasons. A Lange Sohne for their artisanal handcrafted approach, their high horology and cutting-edge innovation and sophistication. Bremont for all they stand for with regards to British watchmaking, their engineering, their excellence and the way they continue to market and position themselves. If it isn't already abundantly clear from my Instagram account, I have very much bought into the Bremont brand and all that they're doing. For what it's worth, I also happen to really like their new strapline. Time is just time. It's what you do with it that counts. Rolex, well, it's nigh impossible not to be impressed with their seeming omnipresence. They've created so many iconic watches over many years, and they've successfully tweaked and improved their watches and designs. Interestingly, while people do, of course, refer to their movements and advances in technology, I suspect that the vast majority of their buyers don't buy a Rolex for the movement. I certainly didn't, nor did I know much at all about the brand. It wasn't important. For me, buying my first Rolex represented a certain level of achievement that I had attained. All I really knew about Rolex was that it was a brand status that I coveted. I wanted to wear that label and tick that box. For me, at the time, it represented a coming of age. As with so many other things in life, there's a good deal of snobbery when it comes to watches. Beyond that, I still don't really know all that much about Rolex. It's a sort of giant, secretive brand that's hiding in plain sight. Rolex just seemed to be so inaccessible. As to which of these three stainless steel integrated bracelet watches I choose to put on my wrist at any given time depends largely on what I'm doing, what I'm wearing, and my mood, which once again comes full circle to how I feel. If we go back to my quote, when you put value and perception in the same sentence, value brings everything to a head, while perception is really an amalgamation of all the senses that culminates in a decision to buy, and then to wear and enjoy. So, wrapped up in perception is a multitude of things which include the product itself, the brand and what it stands for, if you like, their promise, and your experience of all of the above, right from the outset. The products themselves have the ability to disappoint. My sight work did earlier this year when it just stopped working. If this has ever happened to you with your watch, you'll know how it feels. All indications are that it's pretty unusual for a quality timepiece to malfunction, but as we all know, these are mechanical items and occasionally they do go wrong. I accept that, although I'd be less inclined to tolerate this if it were to repeat or if other issues ensued. My perception of brands is, of course, mostly influenced and affected by my first-hand experience, and the experience I just referred to, which directly involved a Wempe boutique, is an interesting case in point. At first glance, it's an A Lange Sohne boutique. It's clearly badged that way, and the boutique only displays A Lange Sohne watches. Frankly, I wasn't even aware of who Wempe were until it came to paying for my Saxonia Thin, when I was presented with a Wempe invoice. The point is, as far as I was concerned, I was talking directly to A Lange Sohne from the outset. However, the reality is, I was dealing with Wempe, and I don't actually have a relationship with A Lange Sohne beyond seeing their work online and watching YouTube videos, wearing and enjoying their products, and dealing with a Wempe boutique. For the vast majority of the time, I'm not sure this really matters. However, in the one instance where I shared my site work experience, it mattered to me. For what it's worth, I have since been contacted by the CEO of A Lange Sohne. First contact came via Instagram, around the time when my fiasco video had notched up 40,000 views. Wilhelm Schmidt then telephoned me to give me reassurances from the brand itself. We had a nice conversation, and I've since been introduced to the A Lange Sohne boutique in Harrods. We'll see how things go from here, but I do nevertheless feel that the A Lange Sohne brand has been somewhat tarnished by my site work experience. In that sense, by engaging with authorized dealers, watch brands permit the authorized dealers to play with their reputation. I have to assume that my experience was unusual and that mostly it's not an issue. However, my personal experience does affect how I feel about the A Lange Sohne brand. The more I think about what happened, the more I feel convinced that the customer, me, should never have been involved with anything beyond a confirmation that the watch is being repaired. I suppose part of the issue was that the Wempe boutique revealed too much information to me, the customer. They lifted the curtain and I had a glimpse behind the scenes. Basically, I should not have been told that A Lange Sohne could not fix the watch under warranty. Oh, and here's a quote to repair for £3,500. Consequently, I think that strengthens a case for watch brands to have their own managed boutiques, in preference to authorized dealers. But, of course, managed boutiques can goof too, and it's never really quite that black and white. So my perception of the A Lange Sohne brand originated from YouTube and is reinforced by the use of their fabulous products on my wrist, primarily, and by what I see online, on YouTube, and what I read about when the brand advances occur, their innovations and the new releases. Compare this with my Bremont relationship, which I believe is rather special and not likely to be repeated. It's time and place stuff. I first became aware of Bremont because a friend bought me one of their watches for my 40th birthday. I'd never heard of Bremont prior to that. This was in 2010, and I'm not sure I would have cared to look beyond having more than one watch anyway. I literally wore the same watch for almost 20 years. Interestingly, my relationship with Bremont over the years has been from top down. The brand was far younger then and were in a totally different stage of development. Today I consider Nick and Giles to be friends, and at the same time I've come to know many of the people around them and within their teams. It really feels more than skin deep. I feel a direct connection to the brand through Nick and Giles, and in addition I also have a huge admiration for the timepiece on my wrist. The strength of my relationship with Bremont is doubtless reflected in my watch collection. I have many of their watches, mostly their limited editions. I just love what they do. As I say, I suspect my relationship with Bremont is a little unusual. I'm reminded of an event I was invited to several years ago. I think someone dropped out last minute from this Christmas press blogger event, and so I was asked if I could stand in, and happily I went. This was a dinner at the Bremont boutique in Mayfair, and it was pretty intimate, with perhaps less than 20 people attending in total. After the meal had been served, a band came together at the front of the room. The drummer took his place behind the drum kit, and Nick and Giles both picked up a guitar. I had no idea they were musical. The band were all wearing Christmas Santa hats, and it struck me at the time that this was going to go one of two ways. Either it was going to completely bomb and be a complete and utter disaster, or it was going to be superb. I couldn't envisage this having a so-so outcome. Either way, it was going to be really rather entertaining. In the event, it was an absolutely brilliant evening, which served only to reinforce my admiration for both Nick and Giles, and all they stand for. I left there that evening thinking to myself, wow, how many other brands, let alone watch brands, would even attempt to do something like that? There was just no need to go there or to take the risk. It was fun, it was irreverent, it was confident, friendly and intimate. Although the music wasn't flawless by any means, it was festive and it felt really great. As I say, I left there that evening with a huge smile on my face. Britt Pierce regularly makes thought-provoking video blogs, and she talks repeatedly about how watches are at the intersection of fashion, art, history and engineering. I agree with her, but what I believe she's missed is not just brand, but she also omits an overarching bit that I think knits all the rest of it together. Sentiment. Some of the things that prompted me to make this video and share these thoughts were the excellent videos by both Teddy Baldessar and Adrian Barker, who in the last 3 months or so have prompted a discussion about what is luxury, what makes luxury watches. What I believe we're all referring to is our own individual perceptions, basically the way we each feel about and perceive something, and how that feeling and then perception prompts us to act. There's often an emotional driver underlying the decisions we make and the actions we take. And yet we tend to convince ourselves that we have rational, sensible thought and that we make sound decisions based on logic. Objective review often gives lie to this. The financial markets behave in much the same way. They're the sum total of all our collective perceptions and are driven by two primary emotions, greed and fear. The markets behave illogically and hold a mirror up to human behavior. When you take a look into the field of inessential luxury goods, like watches, you'll probably recognize similar behavioral patterns. Watch folk tend to refer to these behaviors as our watch journeys, which permits us to change course and direction as we live and learn, as we feel, as we experience life. For my own part, I love all sorts of watches. I own a Casio G-Shock, but I also own an A Lange Sohne Sightwork and a number of others in between. Whether I choose to wear one or the other on any given day largely depends on what I'm doing and how I feel. And my capacity for enjoyment is just that. It's my capacity for enjoyment. What's yours?